right, you're recording.
All right, well, perfect. Thank you, everyone that was able to join today's webinar. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I don't know if you guys are noticing that as well. So thanks everyone that was able to join today. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic is creating massive consequences for the pork industry, and Iowa State University is committed to supporting pork producers navigating this crisis by providing the needed resources that folks need. And some of those resources revolve around nutritional management of growing pigs. And that's one of the consequences of COVID-19 is the packing plant closures across the Midwest that are now creating a backlog of pigs that are ready to go to market or near ready to go to market, but aren't scheduled to be harvested due to the plant shutdowns. And so this is something that John, Patience, Laura Greiner, and Nick Gabler have been putting quite a bit of thought into in the last few weeks. And so I really appreciate what they bring to the table and the expertise that they're bringing to you folks tonight. And hopefully you find resources here that bring value to you and enable you to make stronger and better decisions as you navigate through this time. And so one of the other things too, and I'll start Dr. Greiner and Dr. Patience off here in just a minute. One of the other things that I wanted to point out to you all is that in mid-March, as the fallout from COVID-19 was really beginning to take shape, Dr. Nick Gabler started writing an IACUC proposal and a protocol to generate some research data to support some of the things that John was helping put down on paper to provide as a resource to producers. And so because of Nick's initiative and foresight, we had some funding in the Iowa Pork Industry Center to accomplish that project. But because he acted so quickly, today, actually Nick's graduate students were able to collect 2 weeks worth of production data on those gilts and barrows both that are on that study. So hopefully we got some additional science-based data that we can provide you with tonight to help you make some decisions as well. But to get started with, I'll turn it over to Dr. Greiner and Dr. Patience to kind of navigate through some of the different thought processes and strategies that they've been looking at and discussing with producers across the state as strategies to manage the situation. So Dr. Laura Greiner is a recent nutritionist that's joined Iowa State University and started a little bit over a year ago. We were very fortunate to have her on our team as part of our teaching, research, and extension portfolio. So thanks, Laura, for being on. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Hopefully everybody can hear me. There is a little bit of feedback, so if everybody can mute your microphones, that would be great. So Jason, thank you for the introduction today. Doctors Patience, Gabler, and I appreciate it. Hopefully we can address some of the questions that everybody has tonight. I know this certainly is a challenging time, and there are many questions. We've been receiving many emails a day trying to help everybody in their different situations and try to give you suggestions for what may work in your specific operations. As we know that everybody has unique and different approaches and experiences that they are trying to work through currently. So we'll try to answer hopefully some of the questions that you have tonight. Please remember that a lot of the scenarios that Dr. Patience and I talk about tonight really need to be discussed with a nutritionist, potentially as well your veterinarian or a ventilation expert, based on what you explore and what you think might work well for you and your system. We do again understand this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Some people may have access to corn in bins, some people may not, and so again we're going to try to go through all of these different approaches tonight. We know that a lot of what we're being asked to do, particularly if we're holding pigs because we can't sell them to market at this point, we're going to increase our overall feed cost. We know that there's not much we can do when we have to hold pigs longer on feed. But what we are going to try to talk about tonight is how to maintain these pigs at a certain weight or slow the rate of gain without causing a significant increase in cost. Because what you may hear tonight is some of the approaches, while they might work, might end up being a significantly higher cost than other approaches, again, based on your situation. So we're going to try to talk about some of that and, again, work with your nutritionist to minimize that added cost that you're going to be potentially experiencing and really ensure that the diets that are being formulated and are being used meet all the nutritional requirements. So while we know we can't, or we're not going to necessarily meet lysine needs or energy needs, perhaps, we're really talking about those vitamins and minerals, those things to keep the bones growing and bones strong so that those pigs can walk onto the trucks, as well as just making sure we have the vitamins and the salt and all those necessary vitamins and minerals for just bodily function. So John, before we get any farther into the conversation, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think you've covered it very, very well. Keep an eye on dollars and cents, making sure that that we still are feeding rations that are balanced. I think the only other thing is to keep a focus on animal well-being. That's always a high priority for us, and anything that we discuss today, we'll be talking about that aspect of it as well. So with that, then I'll move on to the first strategy, potential strategy, and that's to feed a low energy, high fiber diet. This might be in some respects one of the easiest strategies to implement, but it's there's still some challenges with it. If we are really serious about reducing growth rate in these pigs, we have to really elevate the fiber substantially. We're thinking absolute minimum of 15% NDF in the diet, but if we want to have a substantial drop in growth rate, we probably want to be up in that 25% or even higher level of NDF. And of course, as we increase the bulk in the diet, we allow energy to float. So we're not trying to balance these diets for energy. Energy will go down. So as an example, just to give you a sense, if we take a regular corn, soy kind of diet and we add 30% soy hulls to that diet, we're going to drop the energy from about 1.5 megacals per pound down to 1.3. So that's about a 14% drop in energy. That's pretty aggressive. Also, keep in mind that this is going to substantially reduce the bulk density of your diets, and that can have implications for manufacturing the diet, for delivering the diet to the farm, and then also delivering that diet to the pigs. So we need to keep that in mind. We know that fiber can be expensive already for most of you in this listening audience. I suspect DDGs are either impossible to get or very short supply and at a substantial cost. And so DDGs may not be an option anymore. We work with soy hulls in the trial with Nick that we'll talk about later on. But there's other options. There's wheat nibs, there's corn germ meal. Wheat nibs has about half the NDF that soy hulls have, so it's going to be tougher to get that NDF level up to where we want it. And corn germ meal is about midway between the two. You should also remember that many of these fibrous ingredients are produced from the outer portion of the seed, and that may be a portion of the seed that's rich in mycotoxins. So we have to be careful about using these high fiber ingredients, as it may affect mycotoxin exposure. And then finally, remember that as we increase fiber in the diet, we're likely to reduce carcass yield, probably at least 1%, if not more than that. So there's a few thoughts. Laura, did you have anything to add?
No, John, I think you covered that topic fairly well. I don't, when we think about the high fiber options, as Dr. Patience discussed, we just have to continue to pursue what options might be available. Might need to be a little bit creative in some of our discussion as to what we might be able to use that might be on farm or near us that that maybe other people aren't using. So if you're a smaller producer and you have a local manufacturing facility, there might be a product there that we may want to pursue. So with that, if there are no additional comments, we can move on to the next strategy. And that strategy is looking at low protein or low amino acid options. This is an option that many of us have discussed in the past, particularly when budgets get a little bit tight. We talk about reducing our lysine level to about 90 to 95% of the pig's requirement. We know that at that level, we tend not to reduce growth. We generally have to get lysine below about 85% to start to see significant reductions in growth. But remember, lysine really is that key component for muscle development, and it doesn't necessarily reduce feed intake. And so we really want to look towards those reductions to be closer in terms of nutrient profile of about 30% to get significant reduction. But there are certain amino acids that really do have an impact on feed intake. So if feed intake is potentially the approach you may want to take, you can look at reducing the tryptophan to lysine ratio to 15% or slightly less than that to reduce the feed intake substantially. Or if you have access to red blood cells and it meets biosecurity requirements, some people could consider altering the branched chain amino acid ratio, and that can certainly impact feed intake as well. Some of the challenges that we have associated with using this approach is certainly if we are targeting a low feed intake, we really still again want to make sure that the nutrients like phosphorus and calcium are being consumed at a high enough level to continue to support bone growth, as well as other vitamins and minerals. Again, remember, we can't overfeed our vitamin and mineral packs because of selenium regulations, but we can continue to work on making sure we can optimize that the best we can. In addition to that, while a lot of us want to just take the soybean meal out, because obviously soybean meal is our key protein component in our feed today, as we remove soybean meal, we can lower things such as potassium, and potassium is a key component to things such as heart function. And so we really have to make sure we're balancing our diets out again to optimize what we can and not cause potential harm with the animal. John, is there anything you'd like to add on lowering amino acids?
No, Laura, I think you've covered it really well. I think the only thing with this particular approach is that if we're doing this earlier in the grow out period to slow down growth, and then the situation with the packing plants improves and we put the pigs back onto a balanced diet, there's a very good chance we're going to see some compensatory gain. So if we're trying to generate compensatory gain, amino acid deficiencies is one way that we generate it. So that's a possible plus for this suggestion that Laura has for reducing growth rate in our pigs. Turning now to our next suggestion, it's using calcium chloride. This is a really technical subject. Interestingly, it's been around for about 40 years that I'm aware of, but then I've been around for 40 years, so but it hasn't been applied that frequently in our business, in our industry. But basically what we're talking about calcium chloride. Calcium chloride is what we call acid salt. And so it generates a bit of an acidemia in the pigs, or increases the acid load on the pigs. And that's what causes them to reduce their feed intake. And you can see on the graph that we show here that when the, no, back one slide, please. Yep. On the graph that you're seeing here, that electrolyte balance can vary substantially in a normal range and have minimal impact on feed intake, which is the dotted line. But once you drop below a level, you can see that feed intake drops precipitously. And that's what we're doing with calcium chloride, is we're getting into that part of the curve, which will lower feed intake. So it's a fairly technical subject, and when you're formulating diets using calcium chloride, you add the calcium chloride, and we're thinking somewhere between 3% and 4% of the diet. So this is not an inexpensive approach to take, because calcium chloride, I understand, it's somewhere around 21 cents a pound, something in that ballpark. And so we add the calcium chloride to the diet, but while we're adding chloride, we're obviously adding calcium. So we're hugely elevating calcium in the diet, which means in order to maintain our calcium phosphorus ratio, which Laura just talked about previously, we have to add a source of phosphorus. And we can't add monocalcium or dicalcium phosphate because that just adds more calcium as well. So we use something like monosodium phosphate, and that's going to cost somewhere around 80 cents, 81 cents a pound to bring the phosphorus up to the right level. And we may still have some limestone in the diet, but we won't have as much limestone in the diet as normal. In this approach, we have to pay attention to that calcium phosphorus ratio. We need to make sure that pigs have access to water all the time, good quality drinking water, because that's really, really important. And we would recommend, thinking about this earlier, and we're only really comfortable recommending for maybe 3 to 4 weeks, just that post-marketing period. We just don't have enough data to really recommend it for earlier than that in the growth period and to be fed for a longer period of time. But we think this is a product that has that you can feed if you've got pigs at market weight or close to market weight to slow them down until you can find a home in a packing plant. Because one of the things that feeding calcium chloride can do is it can cause resorption of bone, and so we don't want to feed it for too long a period of time. So that covers that, I think. Laura, any further comments?
No, I think if you're going to use calcium chloride, it's important to remember that the first week that you use it, feed intake will drop off substantially.
Yeah.
And the animals will somewhat compensate back, and Nick might have a little bit to share on that here in a little bit. But also because of this product having a lot of chloride in it, we really want to make sure they have access to water. It's imperative that water be in front of these pigs at all points in time. So I think that, John, that kind of covers that topic. You did a very nice job with it. So the next topic that I wanted to discuss will be options such as restricting access to feed. This can be very straightforward as far as restricting access to feed. We certainly can consider tightening down feeders a little bit more, minimizing the ability for those pigs to get to the feed. Also, John will talk here briefly about heat increments and summer heat. He's already talked about fiber in the diet, and we know that adding fiber to the diet increases the animal's heat increment. And so between warming a barn, either naturally or through mechanical warming, plus having higher fiber in the diet, can potentially restrict the feed. But one of the big challenges we have with this, and I think we've talked about it or folks have heard about it before, when we use high fiber diets and we don't have a lot of feeder space available, we in particular will trigger things such as tail biting. And so anytime we potentially are going to use these options, we do need to be watching for those vices because they can happen rather quickly. John, do you have anything else to add on reducing feed intake?
Yeah, just on the restricting access to feed, of course, this is dependent on having feeders that can be relatively easily adjusted. And so we have an image of a feeder here. Now, this was in a starter trial, and this level of trough coverage in a nursery reduced feed intake and growth rate. So this would be 10 to 20% coverage of the trough, and then monitor the behavior of the pigs, because if it's restricted too much, as Laura said, behavioral problems can become an issue, and we have to be concerned there, because if the pigs have to compete too much for feed intake, that's going to increase the variability of their growth. Dominant pigs are typically going to get the amount of feed that they want, and so they'll grow well, and the subordinate pigs in the pen feed as they want, so they're going to grow more slowly than you had anticipated. So that is going to be something that will have to be monitored on a barn-to-barn basis. But I think Laura's comment is a good one. We have to also be concerned with social vices.
Hey, John, can I interject just real quick to remind the audience that if y'all have questions during the presentation, you can use the chat box and fire those away as they come to you. And then when we get to the end, we'll circle back up to those and work through those. Sorry for not saying that sooner.
Thanks, Jason. And we already have one question, and I'll just give you a hint. We are going to address that question in the last part of this webinar. So we'll answer that question for you. We're happy to say. To elevated temperatures, we know that if we increase the barn temperature by something in the range of for every 2 degrees above that pig's comfort zone, we're going to reduce feed intake on average. Remember, there's a lot of variables here, by about 0.1 pound a day. So Fahrenheit, about 1 pound per day. And that's assuming comfortable humidity level. And if we have elevated humidity, which of course we're going to have fairly soon in Iowa, then that in itself, humidity by itself will reduce feed intake. And if elevated temperatures on top of that, then that's going to make the reduced feed intake even more. But elevating the temperature is one where we want to be very careful about the well-being of the pigs. We don't want to elevate the temperature in the barn excessively and create too much stress on our animals. So any further comment on temperature, Laura?
I think it's important to recognize that elevated temperatures, much like what happens in the spring and the fall, where we get these nice warm days like today, they'll cool off at night. And when those pigs do cool off in the evenings, they are going to eat. And so as we talk about the elevated temperatures, humidity is going to be a key player, as well as the constant temperature. But again, this has to be monitored and discussed very closely with a ventilation expert as to how you approach that type of program, because that can be challenging if we underventilate a barn. The last thing, Jason, before we go to concluding comments, we wanted to talk just about a few other suggestions or comments that have come across our way that are things that at this time we do not recommend that producers consider. These could be either because there's a great concern of mortality associated with it or potential animal welfare concern. And some of these would be certainly overcrowding animals. We know that when we double stock barns, we do reduce feed intake, potentially because of feeder access. Again, as John mentioned, the dominant pigs will find ways to the feeders, other pigs will not. And so we do run the risk of having animals that are not getting food. Plus, addition to that, with the warmer weather coming up, we could have greater impact of heat stress on some of those pigs and have higher mortality. Lowering water intake certainly is not recommended for risk of things such as animal well-being, as well as potential salt poisoning if not managed correctly. And then the last two items here, certainly lowering salt level in general is also not recommended. We know that it will reduce feed intake, but again, lowering salt can lead to tail biting and other vices. And so we do not want to recommend doing something of that nature. Lastly, there's been a lot of conversation about what if the feed just tastes off, and using off-flavored products to potentially reduce the appetite of the pig. Unfortunately, we do not have any that are available and are approved for GRAS status at this point. And because of that, we cannot recommend any of those products as well. John, do you have any final comments before we turn this over to Dr. Gabler?
No, those are really good points, and particularly the ones on reducing salt level and restricting water supply. Those are, we know they work, but we think they're a bit dangerous because if you go a bit too far, then bad things can happen. So that's why we're not recommending them. I think the final point that I wanted to make is that some of the things that Laura and I have talked about this evening can be used at different stages in the grow out barn. We were primarily interested when we put together the document and started planning this webinar that we really wanted to slow down pigs that are approaching market weight, and that's still our primary focus. So some of the things we've recommended, like calcium chloride, we do not recommend this for earlier in the growth phase. We just don't think that's appropriate until we get more data. But some of the things that we've talked about, like increasing the bulk in the diet and lowering the energy content, taking fat out of the diet, taking growth promoters out of the diet, those are things that can be done earlier in the growth period. We can start those earlier and slow those pigs down so that they're not maybe crowding the barns that are still looking for a home. So we can use those management skills. So please look at our suggestions and consider that all put together to slow down growth late in the finishing period, but some of them can be applied earlier if that's most appropriate for your plan. And that's my final concluding comment, is for everybody. As I talk to producers, I think one of the best things is to have a plan and to think about, this is where my farm is at right now, and where are we headed? What might happen 2 weeks from now? What might happen a month from now? And how do I prepare for that? So these are my practices. This is my strategy for now, given what is going on right now, and be prepared for what changes in those strategies might be required later on when the situation changes. We hope it changes for the better, but if it changes for the worse, then are we prepared with further strategies to handle that? So with that, I'll hand it back over to Jason to talk a little bit about Nick's experiment.
Yeah, thanks, John and Laura, greatly. And I wish Nick could give this update. Unfortunately, Nick is subject to some circumstances that are completely outside of his control today, and couldn't join us. So, but really, Nick, I can't give him enough credit for taking action early on so that we could provide some data in this area, because as you all know, there's not a lot of research that's focused on suppressing growth in market hogs. That's not an area of emphasis for swine nutrition. And so, and as you also know, that in theory, practice always works, but in practice, theory does not always work. And so that was really where Nick wanted to kind of build on what John and Laura were pulling together. And he, as I mentioned, in mid-March, wrote a protocol to do a project at Iowa State University Swine Nutrition Farm. And we happened to have some hogs, some market hogs that were 166, 170 pounds that we could use for this study. So Nick and John formulated 8 different diets, right? So what you can see on the screen here now is a control diet. So this would just be what we would consider a typical commercial diet. And then kind of to some of the strategies that John and Laura alluded to, there were 3 diets 2, 3, and 4, that had 15, 20, and 25% NDF to increase fiber. And so that was the initial strategy. The next 2 diets, diet 5 and 6, were reducing soybean meal altogether and then partially reducing soybean meal. So it's essentially an all corn diet or a 90%, 89% corn diet. And then diets 7 and 8 were a 4% and 2% inclusion of calcium chloride that John and Laura also talked about there. So I should also point out that, and I'll show you the website here when we get to the end, so I won't dwell on some of these formulations and diet composition data, because you can go to the Iowa Pork Industry Center website. This information that John shared and Laura shared, and as well as Nick's results are posted as of this afternoon, are posted on the Iowa Pork Industry Center's webpage. But here you can kind of see those diet formulations with a controlled diet, the standard corn soy base, and then the increasing usage of soybean hulls to achieve the 15, 20, and 25% NDF. In this scenario, the amino acids were held constant, but the energy was allowed to float in those 3 different diets. And then on the next two diets, you can see 97% and 89% corn. On the 97% corn, you can see that soy hulls and soybean meal were completely removed altogether. And then on the 89% corn, that is essentially a mix of the control diet with the 97% corn diet. So that's where you'd have the about almost a 50-50 ration. So, and then the last two diets over there on the right are the 4% and 2% inclusion of calcium chloride. And what you'll notice down on the bottom, by the inclusion of that much extra calcium for John and Nick to be able to maintain a calcium phosphorus ratio where that needs to be, there was the addition of monosodium phosphate in that 4% and then the 2% diet with the subsequently tweaked with limestone to maintain the calcium phosphorus balance in those diets. So so those were the 8 diets that were employed exactly 2 weeks ago today. And Nick's graduate student was able to go out. They've collected 3 different weights. And so this is all the data from those 3 different time points so far. What you can see up in the first set of rows above the first red box is the body weights for each of those dietary treatments at day 0, day 7, and day 14. And so where you see there's a lack of treatment effect on day 0, then you start having significant effects on body weight by day 14 within those 2 weeks. So the data is further broken down here. If you look at it within the first red box there, day 0 to 7, several of the diets were effective in slowing growth based on average daily gain, and the most effective being the 97% corn and the 4% calcium chloride. Although the 15 and 25% NDF as well as the 2% calcium chloride were also effective. As John and Laura pointed out, though, you can have over time some compensatory adaptation to some of these diets. So, and we started to see that. So when you look down here at the bottom red box, some of those averages start to balance out a little bit more as we started getting some repeated measures. And so on the control diet, you can see that over that 14-day window, these hogs gained 2.8 pounds per day. And while it wasn't statistically different, partly because of the number of animals we had available on hand to start the study with, we did see a numerical reduction in average daily gain with the inclusion of additional soy hulls as a fiber source. But really effective was the 97% corn diet that reduced average daily gain to 1.1 pounds per day over the first 14 days of the diet implementation. And the 4% calcium chloride had a 0.15 pounds per day average daily gain. So pretty substantial, and it turns out that in this case, in practice, the theory did work. And but that's something that we needed to validate on behalf of the industry, right? Because when a lot of the work that has been done that this is based out of is on a little bit different type of pig than what we have out now in the industry. So that's the current status. This is, again, 2 weeks. This project will be running for 5 weeks, and we'll continue to update you all regularly on that. This just kind of, this graph here just shows you those same results, but as a percentage. And so as a percentage of the control. So here again, you can see that after 2 weeks, using the 97% corn, there was a 61% loss in gain, and the 4% calcium chloride had a 95% loss in average daily gain. This is what it looks like on a bar graph over time. So what you can see here is on the black line up here on the top is a curve that you would typically expect when feeding market hogs, and each of the lines in between kind of shows the different diets down here. But again, this checkered blue line that's second from the bottom is the 97% corn, and the calcium, the green line is the 4% calcium chloride. And so those do appear to be effective, and how those will look a week from now or 2 weeks from now, we don't know. But this is, if you go to this web page, ipic.iastate.edu/COVID-19, John and Laura's document that they've prepared, in addition to Nick's data, is posted on that website. And Nick's team will be collecting weights every week on Tuesdays, and we'll be updating that document so you can see how this data changes over time, because that also is critical for your all planning, as John points out. Having a plan and being able to execute on that plan as the situation evolves is critical. There's also other resources on that web page as well that you can direct folks to, and many of which are resources on other websites, AASVs, National Pork Board, and other topics related to COVID-19 that you might find useful. So one other thing before I turn it back over to John and Laura and open up and engage on some of the questions. One of the other things, there's a lot of stuff that folks are discussing in dealing with the massive backflow of pigs. And one of the discussions involves emergency disposal, right? And in the case of euthanizing a large number of animals, how will those animals be disposed of? There's actually a faculty member at the University of Maine, and working with Jamie Eggers at the Iowa Pork Producers Association, we're trying to help provide some information on that. And Dr. Hutchinson at Maine University will be providing a webinar on April 29th at 8 a.m. Central Time, and can discuss some of the different things. Just again, another tool in your toolbox that can hopefully help you prepare to have plans to deal with various directions that the situation can go. So if you're on this webinar, we'll certainly send that information. You registered for it, we'll have your email address, so we will send that information to you, how to get engaged in that opportunity as well. So again, if you have questions outside of the questions and discussion that we have today, easy way to get that is to send an email to ipic@iastate.edu. That goes to 2 or 3 different people that then can direct that question to different faculty or field specialists throughout the state, or faculty on campus that have different areas of expertise to help you work through different scenarios and provide you different sources of information to help you. It's a little bit difficult too, given that most people aren't on campus. So another strategy is, if you prefer a phone call, you can call my office number, and what will happen is it'll go to my voicemail because I'm not in my office, but it'll send that voice message to me via email, and then I can direct that to the most relevant person based on the content of your message. So, and again, we work closely. We've got a lot of partners, a lot of faculty at Iowa State, like Doctors Gabler, Greiner, and Patience, are committed to providing resources to the industry, but we really rely heavily and cooperate heavily with the Iowa Pork Producers Association, and Pat McGonigal and Jamie Eggers are excellent team members when it comes to helping provide resources, and they keep us in the loop on things that we need to be doing and ways that we need to reach out. So thank you all for your attendance, your participation. I hope you find this valuable, and I will open it back up to the question box, and we'll see what kind of questions we might have that we can help answer today. And those that we can't, we'll work on finding solutions or answers to them and try to get back to you.
See, Jason, maybe if we could, Laura and I might want to comment a bit on the results of from Nick's study. So
yeah, that's a great point, John. That was an oversight on my part. I should have asked you to see if that makes sense with the way you would have expected that to turn out, as well as what you think are the most valuable pieces to implement from that study so far.
John, I'll let you.
You let me go first this time. Okay, you started this whole thing, and you kept us on time. I'm really impressed. So, just a couple of quick comments. First, Jason, if you could go back to that performance table, if you don't mind, about 3 slides back, maybe. No, one more, please. A couple of comments. Laura mentioned this about calcium chloride, and you can take a look at the 4% calcium chloride these pigs did not do very well on that. And so it took them a week to adjust, which because of how calcium chloride works, that's not surprising, and that's well known. And but then they've adapted to it, and still obviously their growth rate is low. But it just, if you do want to go this route, please understand that the first week it'll take a while. Just like any animal adapting to a new diet, there's going to be an adaptation period there. That's number one. Number two, the 97% corn diet from a slowing things down point of view looks very, very appealing, and that's good. But we need to keep in mind the feed conversion. You know, the feed conversion these pigs on the 97% corn diet was 6.1 compared to 2.5 on the control. And so you want to take a look at the cost of that no soy diet and look at the cost per day and the cost per pound of gain. And then the other comment on that, it would scare the dickens out of me if this was fed for any length of time to younger animals and what this would do to their carcass. We'd have, one could expect pretty tiny loins and pretty thick back fat. So that would need to be kept in mind as well. So it's an extreme, it works. It's a short-term thing. It's probably best done very late in that finishing period, just before market. But it's not something, and Lauren, I'm going to ask for your comment in just a minute, what your thoughts on that are. But it's an extreme diet that makes a nutritionist feel just a little bit anxious. And then my final comment is, when we look at the data, average daily gain responded quite like we expected, in the sense as we increased NDF, average daily gain went down. As we reduced the soybean meal in the diet, average daily gain went down. As we increased the calcium chloride in the diet, average daily gain went down. So that was all fairly consistent. However, when we look at average daily feed intake, remember earlier on we talked about variability of response amongst pigs, and that is certainly borne out in this study, because the decline in average daily feed is not linear within the range of treatments as we would have expected, and certainly not necessarily reflective of the average daily gain. So average daily gain seemed to be a little more predictable, average daily feed not so much. Laura, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, John, I think Nick's off to a great start, and this is a lot of good information. John, we're getting a lot of questions about this 97% corn diet, and particularly on vices. And I think it's important to let everybody know that in this study, these are individually housed pigs. That's what Nick had available at the time in terms of spacing at the farm. So we can't really observe those vices in this study. One would assume those vices are going to be present in a larger scale. In addition to that, we have a lot of questions coming in on potassium, and even the mineral question. So I'll kind of clarify that a little bit using some of Nick's data here to talk a bit about. So I always use the NRC as kind of that minimum approach, right? That's my minimal nutrient requirement before we run the potential of having issues. So we certainly want to follow that as best we can in terms of requirements for potassium and other things. But there was a study, I want to say that was 8 or 9 years ago, that Gretchen Hill put out, where she didn't use minerals in the last 3 phases of finishing diets, and the pigs performed fine. So I'm not talking calcium and phosphorus, but I'm talking about other minerals. And so we do know we have a little bit of flexibility in the minerals, but in terms of the potassium, especially when I look at that 97% corn diet, my comfort level for potassium is doing something like this no more than 2 to 3 weeks. Much like what John is talking about, we go much longer than that, and it makes me nervous. If we're not going to supplement with some potassium in these diets, I really feel like that's about as far as we can push it before we're going to potentially see some long-term issues associated with not having enough potassium in the diet. But I know there are a lot of questions about, genetic companies, vitamin and mineral recommendations, and those are great and valid. But remember, those recommendations come around optimizing growth. And what we're trying to do here is maintain essentially. And so maintenance looks different than optimizing growth in terms of those mineral needs. John, one question that this popped up a couple times as well, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'll ask your opinion on it too, is salt. So we talked about reducing salt, but some people are taking the approach of wanting to increase salt in the diet as a means to reduce feed intake and wanting to know what level is too high. I can tell you many years ago now, we did some, I didn't do the work, but I had some people present the work to me. This was in sows, so keep this in context, but they were feeding about 20 pounds of salt to sows rather than 10 pounds of salt. So doing a 1% salt inclusion, they claimed that the sows had no issues going on that higher level. But again, with most things, you know, while we know it may throw them off feed or slow down their feed intake, when we start playing with salt, we start running the risk of water availability and having some challenges. But I don't have an exact number from grow finished pig perspective, John. I don't know if you have anything on that that maybe you can help shed some light on.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's what we're here for. No, I don't. I'm more familiar with lowering salt, and especially as we were talking earlier in the day, chloride, because a diet that's deficient in chloride can really impair feed intake. But it's a dangerous thing to do, I think. I really don't have an answer for you on going to high salt, other than reinforce your comment that you're running the risk of salt poisoning or salt toxicity if we don't make sure those pigs have good access to water. And especially as we get to warmer weather, that could be even more critical. And just one maybe final point, going back on the issue of potassium, and some people in the audience obviously are aware that much of the potassium in our pig diets comes from soybean meal. Or other protein sources. So when we lower soybean meal in the diet, you're going to lower potassium. And in fact, the 97% corn diet, along with no soybean meal in it at all, at least according to our database, has only 0.03% potassium. So your point, Laura, is a very good one. This would be for shorter term feeding. If somebody wanted to go a little bit longer, then adding something like potassium chloride or potassium bicarbonate as a way to get potassium up to that requirement.
Mm-hmm. I'm just looking through some of the other questions and comments. There was a great one that we didn't really talk about, John, that certainly can be said, that anytime we're trying to do what we're doing today, we can look at taking out additives such as copper sulfate and some of our other potential growth promotants to save some cost. I assume most people are doing that today, as well as taking fat out of the diet. Fat's not cost effective as it is right now with low cost corn. But again, those are some things that you should also for sure have on your plate to be thinking about.
Yes, absolutely, Laura. And because obviously we're not trying to promote growth, we're trying to slow it down. So it doesn't make much sense to have products in there that are going to be stimulating growth or stimulating appetite in the pigs. This thing that we're talking about, this topic that we're talking about, is so foreign to us because we devote our careers, everybody, I'm sure all of the listeners as well, devote our time and our effort and our thought to helping the pigs grow faster. And now we're saying, no, now we want them to grow slower. And it causes us, certainly when we were putting the fact sheet together, we had to really change our thinking. And as one example, when we're talking about slowing growth rate, are we trying to, and lowering feed costs, are we trying to maintain a decent cost per pound of gain? Or are we trying to minimize feed cost per day? And that's a question that's going to be very specific to the individual farm, but that's something that we keep in mind. And we always look at feed cost per day, but it's not something that we optimize. Normally it's something quite different, feed cost per pound of gain or whatever. And so now we have to look at it a little bit differently. Speaking of questions, there was a question on here about calcium and phosphorus. Just let me find it.
Hey, John, maybe while you're looking for that one, I'll ask Laura a question that popped up.
Oh.
One of the questions that came in to me is, what about the combination of different strategies, right? So is there a danger, is there a strategy where you could use a combination of one of these, or a dangerous, a combination that should be certainly avoided? And then also, for, I guess, building on that, are there certain combinations that would maybe work sequentially, one before the other, if it was needed to go for a longer period of time?
That's the $1,000,000 question. I've been working on diets in my spare evening hours and asking many of those same questions, right? So even just if I reduce lysine and I reduce tryptophan, and then I want to reduce valine, what does that look like in terms of just reducing growth and feed efficiency, and when does it become not economical, such as the 97% corn with that higher feed efficiency? We don't have all those answers today. I think it's one thing to kind of reiterate, because we're seeing a lot of questions about vices. Anytime that we offer the potential for these animals to grow at what they're biologically destined to grow, we run the risk of creating a vice. So whether that's reducing lysine or increasing temperatures or crowding a barn or anything. And so as we potentially add additional components to our program to try to slow pigs down, you do run the risk of having additional vices show up in your barn, higher mortalities. Those types of things are going to certainly be present. We are entering into a time of year where we have people that are actively out in the fields trying to get a crop in the ground. And so that means probably a little less frequent monitoring of the barns than what we might like, especially when we're implementing some of these changes. And so I think it'll be really critical to try to manage it the best you can. But we do believe that as we add additional components to this, you could potentially run into higher levels of vices. In addition to that, things that do work well, Mike Brum's been on here offering some discussion on temperature and humidity, and I think he'd be an excellent resource. When we look, as well as like Brent Ramirez and Jay Harmon in our groups, but when we think about what's going on, adding fiber and increasing the temperatures, particularly as spring comes in, I think that will certainly help folks start to get to that point where some of these added components will work nicely together. Hopefully we don't have to look into going into June and July with these programs, but if we do, the summer heat will actually work in our favor for a lot of what we're trying to accomplish. John, did you find your question on calcium and phosphorus? Oh, you're on mute, John. There you go.
There we go. Sorry, Amanda. the boss behind the scenes is looking out for me, and I'm not letting her. So, yeah, the one question was about lowering phosphorus level and go to a higher calcium phosphorus ratio. And we ran a study. We're working on a paper on it right now. And if you have a diet that is marginal in phosphorus and you elevate calcium, you are definitely going to lower growth rate. We got a linear response as we increase calcium in diets that were deficient in phosphorus. So maybe about 0.05% deficient, 0.07% deficient in phosphorus. But at the same time, and we used X-ray photography and showed that the bone development really declined as well. So if one wanted to do that, that would be definitely something you do for a short period of time. That is not a longer term strategy, because that would not be good for well-being of the pigs. So that's there's a strong caution on that one. I think we've got some more questions here on potassium, and you covered the vices very well. Magox, Magox is not like calcium chloride, because magnesium oxide will be an alkaline salt rather than an acid salt. And as you saw in the slide that I showed, going to more alkaline type diets, we call it alkalinogenic diets, that doesn't really affect feed intake or growth rate very much. So if Magox is doing something to feed intake, which I'm not familiar with, then it's not due to electrolyte balance. It must be due to something else. And if somebody's got some data on that, I'd love to see it. Please send it our way.
Yeah, John, I saw another good question here on micron size. So should we just consider increasing particle size in our corn? So potentially reducing feed efficiency and going that route. How do you feel about that?
I guess I'm puzzled by that one, Laura, because that to me is likely to increase cost because it's going to impair feed efficiency. And I'm not sure I see a whole lot of effect on growth rate. There might be some, but I would be I'd be puzzled by that one. What do you think, Laura? Yeah, my experience with particle size would be it affects feed efficiency, but the impact on growth rate is not great. Not the kind of growth rate reductions we're looking for here.
Right, that would be my take as well. It probably is going to be one of those practices that will cost you significantly more than what you'll get out of it for the time being. So it would be one that I would put pretty low on my priority list or option list.
There's another interesting question here, Laura, and Jason, you shut us down here when you think it's appropriate, because Laura and I, we can do this all night. This is fun. Although the circumstances that we're talking about sure as heck aren't. Sorry about that. But the question here was about what of these options are synergistic or compatible with each other's, and which are the ones that should not be in combination. And so one that would come to mind is the higher fiber diet and the restriction of access to feed would both combine to reduce feed intake and therefore growth rate. So I don't see a problem there. The high temperature in combination with restricted feeder, but you may not need that. That may not be required with high temperatures. If we're going to combine that with high fiber diets, remember, Laura referred to this earlier, the high fiber diet is going to increase heat increment, and the pigs feel hotter, and therefore the impact of heat stress is going to be exacerbated. So if you're going to combine those two, you got to be very, very careful, because you could very easily go too far.
Agreed. Jason, how are we doing on time? Would you like us to continue, or what would you like to do here?
Sorry. We're coming up on an hour, and so it might be best to adjourn. And, you know, Amanda, if we could save the question list, and I know some of us got questions that were sent individually, and kind of go through those maybe tomorrow, and make sure that we did talk about everything that was brought up, and anything that we think maybe that we've overlooked. We could synthesize some comments and either add that to the document on the web page or distribute that out to the email to the participants. So that could help create some sort of an FAQ document maybe that we could provide to folks based on what we're seeing here, and feedback that we get after tonight. So, but I really want to thank, I wish I could thank Nick in front of everybody, but really thank you, John and Laura, for what you guys bring to the producers in the state and to the country here at Iowa State. Your expertise is valuable, and appreciate you taking the time and providing it.
Well, thank you everyone for your time tonight. I'll let John provide any conclusions he may have, but we do appreciate your time tonight. We know your time is precious. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, however we can support you as you go forward with these difficult decisions that you have ahead of you.
Likewise, Laura, I would agree that these are really, really difficult times, and if we can help in any way, I hope we've helped tonight, but if there's other things we can do to be of assistance, we're here, and that's our purpose, so please feel free to reach out. I would like to reiterate what Jason said about Nick. It was almost magical how quickly he was able to get that experiment up and running. He recognized the need, and he figured out a way to make it happen, and as a result, we had those data to share with you tonight that would not have happened without the leadership of Nick. And thanks particularly to the people at Pork Industry Center, Jason and Amanda Chipman. Amanda's behind the scenes, she's the glue and keeps us going. Jason has played a central role in planning the webinar and helping get it organized along with AC and getting invitations out and so on. So thank you all very, very much, and good luck to you in the coming weeks.